Welcome back to Kitco News. I'm Jeremy Safran. As we are just a few weeks away from Trump taking office, Bitcoin continues to break records, this week hitting a new all-time high above 106,000 US dollars. In fact, it took Bitcoin just over 15 years since its creation to breach the $100,000 level, and all eyes are now on the strategic Bitcoin reserve in the US. Trump recently reaffirmed his crypto commitment. Since Trump won the US election back in November, Bitcoin has surged more than 50%. So what does this mean for Bitcoin going into 2025? And of course, what impact will it have on gold in the longer term? Here to break it all down for us is Deven Soni. Deven is the CEO of Matador. He is also a seasoned investor with a background in private equity and technology investment. Deven worked at Goldman Sachs and Highland Capital Partners as a technology investor before moving into the blockchain space back in 2016. It's great to have you back on the show, Deven. Good to see you.
Great to be here. Thanks again.
Let's jump into this Bitcoin reserve. Obviously, it's getting a lot of attention right now, and it's gaining some steam very quickly. A new bill has been proposed in Texas to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve to combat inflation and economic volatility. Looking closer to Canada, Vancouver City Mayor Ken Sim is also urging the City Council to explore the integration of Bitcoin into municipal finance strategies, emphasizing the cryptocurrency's potential to bolster financial stability amid volatile fiat markets. And one major narrative driving Bitcoin is Trump's administration ushering in a friendly regulatory environment. Sentiment around the alternative currency is on the rise, and Bitcoin itself, as I mentioned, up a staggering 150% this year. Speaking with CNBC late last week, Trump hinted at ambitious plans for crypto, saying, quote, "We're going to do something great with crypto because we don't want China or anybody else, not just China, but others, embracing it. We want to be ahead of them." When asked if he plans to build a crypto reserve similar to the country's oil reserve, Trump responded, "Yeah, I think so." So, Deven, do you think we'll see a strategic U.S. Bitcoin reserve in 2025?
I think it's really likely that we're going to see, this happen in a bunch of step functions. I think the first step function will be, the U.S. announcing that as, various government parties, may confiscate Bitcoin used in various activities, that they just don't sell the Bitcoin, right? I think that's kind of the first step. The second step is, a trickier one, which is saying, hey, we're going to take X part of the overall budget and buy Bitcoin. I think that's a trickier one. But, what I think we're going to see is that, in order to kind of front run the news, we're going to see a lot of other countries really stepping into a Bitcoin reserve decision. And I think that's actually going to push the US's hand to, sort of follow suit. So I think it's going to be a bit of dominoes. We don't necessarily know which domino will fall first, but I think the vast majority will kind of, start looking at Bitcoin much more seriously. And the US will, I think, be a big leader in that, especially in the early days.
Yeah, it's pretty wild just to watch the government support as well as just retail investors pile into Bitcoin. If this happens, we've had other analysts come on and say it could happen as quick as Q2 of next year. How soon do you think that this is a potential?
I think Q2 is really likely. I mean, I don't think it's going to be the first, the inauguration speech or anything like that. But I think, looking into the first two quarters, I definitely see a very high likelihood of, some positive announcements, because, I think the first quarter is really going to be repositioning the government, getting, sort of a new, sort of SEC and Fed moving in the right direction. And then, there you'll have a lot more sort of broad-based support.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've had a lot of support already. Obviously, the markets, they're getting some whispers here, getting excited. If this happens, what will it mean for Bitcoin price in 2025? I mean, we're already at 106,000.
Right. I mean, I think if you look at typical kind of bull markets, right, I think most people are calling this year the year of sort of, $200,000 to $300,000 Bitcoin, and I certainly see that that's quite a possibility. I mean, I think you tie government spending with, corporate spending and the appetite that the MicroStrategies and MicroStrategy style businesses have had in Bitcoin. And those are, that's when you start making large purchases at a point when the entire world is extremely bullish and not really wanting to sell. So I think you've got some really interesting dynamics for a pretty strong run up in price.
Yeah, I mean, what does this mean for the U.S.? I mean, we're seeing so much debt. If this was to happen, I mean, what does that mean for us here in terms of the U.S. dollar?
Well, I think that that's kind of one of the reasons why you'll see the U.S. wanting to do it, right? Like the biggest thing for the U.S. in the next few years is, sort of winning these trade wars that are, whether they're real or invented, they're there. And I think as you see other, there's this kind of battle for, currency sovereignty, obviously Canada has some challenges over the last couple of years and, into the future. But when you think about the US, they're going to want to one up Russia. They're going to want to one up China. They're going to want to one up all these other countries that are looking at Bitcoin. So I think that at least having the US plant a flag will be really, really important to ensure that the world thinks that the government is sort of progressive in thinking about the future in the same way that the rest of the world is.
Yeah, Deven, do we think, are we going to be forced to reevaluate the current fiat system with all of this, or do you think it's not going to have much impact here?
I think in the short term, I mean, if you look at the Trump election cycle, I don't think it's going to have a major impact. I think, there's enough rope here to stimulate the economy just with sort of gradually lowering interest rates. So because of that, I think there's a couple of years of just real positivity in the news. And I think that especially as, ideally we see inflation tapering off a bit, that's going to be a really, really good combination. And I don't think there's going to, I think there's not really a lot of alternatives to the US dollar right now. And because of that, if the US dollar strengthens itself through, these actions like Bitcoin, we're going to be in a really, really good position to maintain, sort of this dominant, kind of global currency, which is rather important. And I think having Bitcoin tied to that narrative and having the Bitcoin tied to the dollar is going to be a really, really good signal for folks that have been kind of, calling for the death of the dollar for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, let's talk about it, because as of July, governments around the world collectively held 2.2% of Bitcoin's total supply, according to data from CoinGecko. And that includes the United States, which possesses nearly 200,000 Bitcoin, valued at over $20 billion at the current prices. China, the UK, Bhutan, and of course, El Salvador are among the countries with significant Bitcoin reserves. This according to the Bitcoin Treasury data. Other nations are also exploring cryptocurrency reserves as a potential strategic asset. Earlier this month, Russian President Vladimir Putin criticized the current U.S. administration, accusing it of undermining the U.S. dollar's role as the global reserve currency. Putin said, quote, "For example, Bitcoin, who can prohibit it? No one." He argued that countries are turning to alternative assets, including cryptocurrencies, to escape the political risks of relying on the dollar. Do you see other countries trying to beat the U.S. in, getting Bitcoin onto their reserves?
I do, but I don't necessarily think it's sort of, maybe in the case of China and Russia, it's as a means to, escape dollar dominance. I think with other countries, really, it's a means to sort of bolster the balance sheet. I think you see an appreciating asset that has finally received, strong global support. And I think you see, even the dollar, right? Like, I think everyone can see sort of the money printing that's happened in the last couple of years. Every time there's a new sort of government entity, a kind of trend and cycle like we're seeing now, there's going to be a whole new host of, programs that created, defense spending and things like that. So I think while that part is really important, governments just want to sort of have their own footing, right? And that's kind of the basis of it. Not so much saying, hey, we've got an alternative to the dollar here. I don't really see a lot of people saying, El Salvador aside, saying Bitcoin today is going to be sort of the global world currency. But I think it's certainly really, really important. Like, I treat it much more like gold than, an alternative to the dollar these days.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we are hearing so many rumblings that, the sovereigns are already coming in and buying Bitcoin, undisclosed already, trying to front run the U.S. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when you see, $500 billion of sort of, kind of appreciation in Bitcoin, that's coming from somewhere. And obviously the MicroStrategy world are a big part of it. But I think we're almost certain that there's a lot of buying in countries. It's just not called part of the national, sort of reserve at this point. Maybe they'll announce it sort of when it's material.
Yeah, no, it's been fascinating to watch. I mean, we've been reporting on it here, this massive climb on Bitcoin all year. How do you figure out where the top is when you're in the midst of such a large rally?
Well, I think, you really have to almost take this kind of bottoms up approach a bit, where you look at what the largest buyers of Bitcoin are doing. And I think you look at companies like MicroStrategy, which have said, publicly they want to own, 5% of all of, sort of the world's Bitcoin. I think you look at countries and governments wanting to do the same thing. So I think as you sort of see the capital for those things kind of get allocated, I think those are signals to be bullish. And I think you look at, MicroStrategy's ability to raise capital is a really, really good signal for that. And if those things start going away, I think that would be when, it's time to sort of, button up a little bit, right? And hibernate for winter again is when, the capital flows sort of become less prominent.
So that hasn't happened yet, my friend. What's your price outlook for the end of next year?
I'm going to go right in the middle here and call it 250,000 for end of 2025.
Interesting. Okay. Well, obviously, the perception of Bitcoin has been shifting over the years, but some of Wall Street's biggest names remain unconvinced about its value. I wanted to get your thoughts on how these influential figures view Bitcoin and what it means for its future. Let's start here with JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon. Back in 2017, he famously called Bitcoin a fraud, and even said that he would fire any JP Morgan employee caught trading it. Fast forward 7 years to 2024, during a CNBC interview at the World Economic Forum, he struck a different tone. Still skeptical, but less combative. Dimon said, quote, "My personal advice is don't get involved, but I don't want to tell any of you what to do. It's a free country." Then, of course, we have BlackRock CEO Larry Fink. In 2017, he described Bitcoin as an index of money laundering. But today, he's singing a very different tune. Not only does Fink now run the world's largest Bitcoin fund, but he's also been vocal about Bitcoin's role in portfolios, calling it digital gold. Finally, we have to talk about Warren Buffett, chairman and CEO of Berkshire Hathaway. He's remained one of Bitcoin's harshest critics. Back in 2018, he called it rat poison squared. He's also said that it wouldn't take Bitcoin, that he also said he wouldn't take all the Bitcoin in the world for $25. Last year, Buffett reaffirmed his stance, comparing Bitcoin to gambling, saying people like to play the lottery. They're appealing to the gambling instinct. So we have a pretty stark contrast here, obviously, Deven. On one side, we have this evolving acceptance from figures like Larry Fink, and then on the others, we got Dimon and Buffett. What do you see these options? How do you see them playing out in the next 5 years?
Well, I think the really interesting kind of notion here is Bitcoin is somewhat like the zombie apocalypse, right? It's like you can sort of like go and become a Bitcoiner. You rarely see people kind of become Bitcoiners and sort of reverse their stance. At least in the last couple decades, you really haven't seen it. So I think some people are going to stick to their guns because it's a principled issue for them. But I think when you see the capital flows, when you see the opportunities, when you see I think to me the most interesting part of the whole cycle is really again going back to MicroStrategy and how that their business in Bitcoin has created this entire, financial asset class around volatility, around, sort of these zero coupon convertible bonds. I think, when you look at these convertible bond funds now, their largest positions are MicroStrategy. And when you look at sort of the bonds as the size of the global marketplace, far exceeds equity. So I think, we're seeing this as becoming more and more part of the way the financial sausage in the world is made. And I think it's really, really hard to pull it out. So I think that while some people may not choose to transact in those forms of businesses, I still think that, it's already made, right? It's like the milk's already spilled.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing some of these hedge funds, going in short MicroStrategy. Some of them thinking it's not a very good idea. Others obviously taking the trade. What's your idea here? What do you think is going to happen with MicroStrategy over the next year?
Well, I think the big things with MicroStrategy specifically are what's their path to raise more capital to buy more Bitcoin. That's kind of their business model, right? Raise capital either through bonds or equity. Today, they trade at roughly a 2.5 times multiple to their Bitcoin balance sheet. So they're 2.5 times net asset value. So as long as you're sort of at that level, you should the smart thing to do would be to continue to sell equity, continue to raise capital. So the question ends up being so for now, I think in perpetuity you keep doing what you're doing and keep the infinite money glitch so to speak kind of going. If those NAV ratios kind of converge, so the company starts trading at 1 times or below its Bitcoin balance sheet, then the question is, what do you do? And I think that's going to be when the questions are really answered about what this market looks like. But I think for now, because you have such a financial infrastructure and, it's kind of like the mortgage business, right? You have a mortgage and you have a bunch of financial products built on top of it. I think that's what you've got with MicroStrategy and these other Bitcoin as a balance sheet companies is this entire financial infrastructure built on top of it. So the whole, system is built based on sort of this premium a little bit. So I think we're going to see it perpetuate for a while. Plus, there's not, a lot of people, again, this is the same concept where if you become a Bitcoiner, you generally don't sort of unbecome a Bitcoiner. So people that are sort of long MicroStrategy are not typically the ones that are going to be dumping because they don't believe in Bitcoin anymore.
Yeah, yeah, well said. Okay, well, obviously, we have all the attention on Bitcoin. Where does that leave gold? I mean, we've witnessed a historic year for gold. It's up more than 28% year to date, trading above $2,600 an ounce here on the spot side. Central banks have continued to stockpile gold at record levels this year. And in the third quarter, we've even seen Western investors take an interest in gold, something we've been waiting for quite a while here. But all major headlines still focus on Bitcoin. Even more public companies starting to hold Bitcoin on their balance sheets. I got to get your perception here on your outlook onto gold in 2025.
No, well, I mean, I think hitting the all-time highs, again here are extremely bullish for the sector. I think that Bitcoin has probably been seen this year as more of a velocity play than gold, and people like, the velocity markets. However, to me, the argument in the battle here isn't, gold versus Bitcoin as much as it is, sort of store value assets like gold and Bitcoin versus, sort of everything else. And I think if you look at both, types of assets versus the dollar, the Canadian dollar, you've done, significantly well holding either. I think overall, we're going to see more governments rebalance their holdings away from, sort of fiat assets and towards assets like Bitcoin and gold. And over time, that's going to just create an outsized return for gold relative to, again, fiat currencies. Again, it's hard to say with Bitcoin. I think there's some dynamics at play that are not controllable, right? It's a designed sort of currency that where the price appreciates because of sort of the limited cap. Obviously you've got, gold mines being found every day. I think people sort of treat gold in many large countries, India, like places like that, as this currency a little more than Bitcoin. Bitcoin stopped being currency a long time ago, and so I think that the big question is really how these things are going to interplay together more so than which one is better or for which use case.
Yeah, yeah. And as I mentioned there, I mean, we finally have some Western investors coming to the table here, seeing the value in gold and maybe not going after that riskier trade on the Bitcoin front. Deven, what do you think will be the main drivers for the price of gold going into 2025 and up until next year at the end?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, the really interesting about what happened to Bitcoin was that you had these large buyers. So with gold, I think it's the same thing. You've got these large sovereign buyers that are really driving so much of the demand in the market. What you're not seeing as much is, this new generation of young people, right? People in their 20s, 30s, they aren't buying gold yet. And I think that to me is what's going to be a really, really good tell for what happens to gold is, can the World Gold Council, can the ecosystem, create products and offerings to, drive gold towards young people that have a lot more free capital, right? No kids, less, kind of all these things. So to me, that's a really, really important point that we need to sort of see the answer to, sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I mean, obviously bridging that gap. We've even seen some of the most classic gold bugs get a little bit more curious about gold. Have you seen a huge, substantial narrative change there from your perspective too?
I think the interesting thing is the economy today. It's a really weird one, right? Like, because the economy today is broadly bullish, and usually people are flocking to gold when the economy is not as bullish. So that'll be kind of the tell to me is if there's a real economic downturn, what happens to Bitcoin versus gold, which kind of stays and which doesn't. So I think to me that's kind of the important part of the narrative, right? Like you rarely see people saying, "Hey, stock market's about to be up 30% this year, buy a bunch of gold," right? Like, I think there is obviously a likelihood of, some challenges in the economy with a bunch of things. There's wars, there's trade wars, there's tariffs. So I think as those things come to fruition are going to be when we see gold really kind of, flex its muscles a little bit.
Yeah, what are some of the biggest risks facing the U.S. economy and the world into 2025? I know you just teased it there, but I think it's a good opportunity to talk about some of those.
Yeah, to me, it's the biggest one is really sort of the these tariff wars that are kind of being alluded to or have been alluded to for the last few months. I think when you think about the way the U.S. is looking at revisiting how the country and the debt is, at the country is financed, right? Saying, hey, we want to reduce taxes, we want to increase tariffs. Well, I think there's a whole bunch of, game theory that happens after that decision is made. And, some of those things are, other countries, have their own tariffs that get created. Well, the cost of goods increase if the imports are that sort of flow of funds isn't changing, which means now there's sort of inflation in the economy. And what do you do when there's inflation? Well, the typical default state has been to raise interest rates, which I think wouldn't necessarily solve this form of inflation because it's tariff driven, right? So I think there's this weird cycle where we haven't really seen the full play out yet. And to me, that there's a whole lot of risk associated with that kind of that kind of stew that's being made here, where I don't think anyone can really predict what the end result here. It might be, a whole lot of dollars for the government and reduce taxes and, great government spending, or it might just be that, regular citizens can't afford, groceries or cars anymore. So I think it's really going to be hard to see what the end result is here.
Yeah,
But I think there's a chance that there's, some downside from it.
Okay. Obviously sticky inflation, it's still sitting around more than the Fed wants. How do you see gold responding in this environment we just talked about?
Well, with gold, I think again we're going to start seeing a continued buying and a continued appreciation.
Yeah.
I think again, like we sat here, gold breaking $2,000 for better part of a decade, and now we're finally kind of crossed that barrier. I think the seal has been broken. I think governments are going to again start stepping in, and I think we'll see some real appreciation. I feel like last time I was on here, I was teasing $2,500 gold, and it's finally broken that. So I think we're seeing some good good cycles here.
Yeah, it's certainly changed quite a bit. Okay, I want to get into the Fed, but before we do that, just before you were mentioning the governments will rebalance their holdings from fiat to Bitcoin and gold. I want you to expand on that. What's your view on the dollar next year? I mean, are we at a peak here?
Well, I think, the interesting parts of this are going to be how do interest rates, impact this decision. I don't think we're at a peak dollar, however, because I still don't see an alternative. I don't think that the yuan is an alternative. I don't think the euro is a great alternative. The Canadian dollar is obviously challenged, right? So I think at this point, people are stuck with the dollar, which is not sort of the worst thing in the world to be stuck with. So I do think there's going to be some diversification, but I don't think there's going to be a massive tectonic shift anytime soon.
Okay. I mean, the Federal Reserve is set to meet this week, and according to economists at Goldman Sachs, it's likely to signal a slower pace of rate cuts going forward. While the 25 basis point reduction on Wednesday is still expected, the Fed may opt to skip cutting interest rates into its January meeting. What's your take on this? I mean, what does the Fed monetary policy response look like next year?
Well, I think they really have to closely monitor what the first, 100 days of this presidency looks like for the stock market. Right now you've had what some people like calling this Trump pump. So, there's been a whole lot of asset appreciation, which I think is obviously a great sign. But the downside of that is that's been despite having, these 5%, sort of ish interest rates. So I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of aggressive cutting, because I think if they cut now, they're going to lose one of the tools in their tool belt if there are some sort of economic issues down the line. Things seem like they're humming along just fine, even with the rates where they are.
Yeah, but yet we see that sticky inflation. We still know that the Fed hasn't reached that 2% that they keep talking about. Where do you see inflation? And then these employment numbers, there's some of the data that we're seeing. What do you think that's going to look like next year?
Well, it's a great question. So I think that, inflation, and again, I think to me, this goes back to sort of some of the decisions that are being made. Inflation is in many ways, yes, there's some things that you can't control, supply chain issues, but there are many things you can control. And I don't think the Trump administration has really focused on inflation as an issue that they want to solve. So because of that, I think the other items are going to sort of trump that. And I think inflation probably is going to sort of stick around where it is, if not even creep up again. Hopefully that, sort of is mitigated by sort of the rest of the economic, sort of improvements in the market. But I think to me, that's kind of where we're sitting. And then on the job side, I think there's two sides, right? One is, stock market goes up and people want to grow, M&A happens and things like that. But there's also, you think about Doge, right? The government efficiency, and you've got, one of the largest employers in the world and a whole bunch of people, including the president, saying we're going to slash all these, departments and things like that. So I think it'll be sort of this really interesting play out with what happens with, employment inflation over 100 days. But I think it's really going to be set by the policy turns that happen in the next, few months.
Yeah, it'll be always interesting. I always like when we get that data and they strip out the volatile, energy and food. I think we all need some energy and food, Deven. It's pretty wild that they kind of remove that from the data. Okay, I want to switch over and talk about your company, Matador Technologies, is a leader in the Bitcoin ecosystem. First of all, congratulations on going public, a huge milestone. Talk us through that journey about taking this company public.
Absolutely. So, we built this company or started it right after the pandemic. And it was started when a lot of other digital products, were under a whole lot of pressure. There's companies like FTX and Celsius and things like that, BlockFi failing because there's very little transparency in the economy. And I think for companies that hold assets and fiduciaries, having a whole level of transparency is extremely important. So what we wanted to do, first of all, at Matador was to build, as I touched on earlier, gold is a phenomenal asset, but it's not an asset that has really attracted young people to date. So what we wanted to do was, build a product and, tongue in cheek, that makes gold great again, right? Make something that people want to own. They find it fun, engaging, something they talk about, not just something that they kind of bury in the back of their closet and forget about. So that was the kind of the crux of the business. And the reason for going public was to say, hey, we've got, world-class auditors here, the whole entire financial ecosystem saying, this is a sound company. Their gold reserves are what they say they are. Their business activities are what they say they are. They're not, buying a bunch of things that they shouldn't be or holding a bunch of things they shouldn't be. And I think those were some of the big downfalls of these other, kind of digital asset custodians and things like that over the last couple of years. So the goal of the last couple of years for us has been to get public, to create that really unimpeachable level of transparency at the business.
Yeah, interesting. So obviously a long procedure for you. You tease it a little bit there, but with Bitcoin being past 100,000, I mean, why now? And what does this mean for the company and the Bitcoin ecosystem?
Right. So, I think the way we look at sort of Bitcoin is it's actually very interesting, right? On this sort of chat, we've really talked about Bitcoin as a store of value and an asset and something that appreciates. But, to me, a really, really interesting part of the cycle is really this evolution of Bitcoin, not just as, something you lock away, but something you build on top of, like Ethereum or these other projects. So when we started looking at gold and looking at building a digital version of gold, we spent a whole lot of time looking at the changes happening in cryptocurrency and in Bitcoin specifically. And over the past couple of years, what's been happening is that, a lot of really amazing products and projects have been being built on top of Bitcoin. So I think, if you look today, there's, billions and billions of dollars of assets, of, real world assets and loans and, financial instruments and primitives being built on top of Bitcoin. And I think for us, we see that as one of the most exciting trends in the market. And it's something we're watching really closely as we build our digital gold products.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, well, I mean, you talk about digital gold. Matador is subscribed as an ecosystem company for Bitcoin. For our viewers who may not be familiar, elaborate a little bit more as to what that means here, Deven.
Sure. So, I think the way we really lead our company is we call it a company that makes, real world assets more accessible to people. And, the first asset we're starting with is gold. That will expand into, other metals and eventually other products. But when we talk about, sort of what that means with Bitcoin, I think we really are making a, pretty close decision to saying we want to build this on top of Bitcoin. We want Bitcoin to be kind of the framework and the backbone that we build our gold products on top of. And what that means is now there's, hundreds of millions of users that own Bitcoin today, that have a wallet. We want those people to be able to own our products just as seamlessly as they can buy, other digital assets or cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, I mean, obviously, there's quite a few things that kind of differentiate this company from other Bitcoin-focused companies, but talk to me about the offerings there. I mean, what the plan is here.
So I think the plan really, in Q1 is to sort of really officially launch our digital gold product. The goal there is to say we have this globally accessible product that's kind of gold backed, that has all the great things about gold, but also all the great things about kind of fun, financial instruments that, that kind of younger people like, right? So if you think of like what are the types of assets that younger people tend to invest in, right? They're, sort of more popular stocks. There's, Tesla and Apple, there's NFTs and there's, cryptocurrencies and there's decentralized finance. So like all these like ecosystem driven things. And what we wanted to do was really build a product that treats gold in the same manner as those types of instruments and financial primitives. So that's kind of, for Q1, the step is to really build that gold product, get kind of this global adoption with it so that it becomes sort of this, de facto standard. And then eventually do the same with, silver and copper and other types of assets using the same kind of backbone that we built with gold.
Fascinating. Yeah, I know that you just started trading on the TSX Venture under the ticker symbol MATA. I want to talk to you a little bit about going public here, because we talked about getting those younger investors into the gold market and making gold great again. I like it, by the way. Talk to me a little bit about that strategy. How do you engage these Bitcoin enthusiasts and get them involved?
Well, I think it's what something we've talked about earlier, right? Like one of the things about Bitcoin is there's this volatility, right? The price goes up, price goes down. It's something you can talk about and watch every day. For a whole lot of most young people's lives, right? If you looked at gold and you looked at gold, 6 months or a year later, you sort of saw the same price, give or take, right? So I think one of the things that we want to do to make things more interesting is to be able to kind of embed a collectability and kind of fun component to gold, so that you can, you create this sort of, volatility, and you create this sort of differentiation by saying, hey, we've got these limited edition, gold products that are kind of art based. So now each one is different. Some may have more value, some may have less value, but it's all subjective. So people can kind of decide and ascribe value to it. And what that means is now you've got something that isn't just sitting here where you're like watching it not move very much or go up, 1 or 2% a year, but you can sort of trade it. You can treat it like, my kids are, 7 and 8, and they're obsessed with Pokemon cards, and they're, trading all day. And I think we want to kind of create products like that, again, you create sort of this joy and fun in sort of the, the product, not just sort of a store value asset that you kind of bury in an ETF somewhere.
Right. Yeah. I mean, speaking of ETFs, last year, or well, I guess it's 2024 still, but we've been talking about all year these regulatory challenges. First, we were waiting on those ETFs to be approved. Of course, they were. Do you see Bitcoin getting more regulatory clarity in 2025? I mean, what roles can a Matador play in that?
So absolutely. I think that is actually the thing that most people are waiting for. If you've been a Bitcoin insider, since 2010 or 2015, or better part of a decade, the one thing that's really given you a lot of pause has been, what does the government treat Bitcoin like, or what does the government treat crypto like? And I think that gives, and especially when people are building on top of it, it's really, really hard to do when you don't have regulatory clarity. So I think as that clarity happens, yes, there'll be some price appreciation, but even more than that, it's going to be treated as the backbone of many more exciting financial assets, which I think is extremely exciting for the entire space. So typically one of the biggest arguments about crypto, or the knocks on crypto, is that you don't use it for anything. It's people trading crypto to trade crypto. The reality was the vision of these projects was created in a manner so that you could actually do things a lot more quickly, a lot more seamlessly, and at a lot lower cost. And I think those things are also very true about crypto. But the problem is that, people have not been willing to kind of risk really, really high value assets by, digitizing them or tokenizing them, because there's just no visibility on what that means legally. So if we get legal clarity, which I fully expect over the next kind of, year or two, especially in the US and other markets, that means it opens up the floodgates for new products to get built on top of crypto, which makes it extremely more useful, which I'm very excited about.
Yeah, an exciting time for sure. Obviously, no crystal ball here, but as we're talking about Matador, and while I have you here, Deven, where do you see that ecosystem evolving within your company, say over the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, we think that one of the interesting things about, kind of blockchains and digital assets are, these innovations, like, because these things are backed by software, these innovations can kind of go from one project to another very quickly. So what that means is if you have a cool feature at some project, it can migrate really quickly with software to another project. So, we think that because of that, it's actually going to help create even more, sort of levels of Bitcoin dominance, which means now, because Bitcoin is the largest sort of, cryptocurrency project by users, it can sort of take the best parts of other projects and embed it into its own, which means now you've just got a much larger audience for these types of projects. So to me, that's kind of the biggest driver, is really just sort of the fact that you can copy paste, cool features and things like that. So to me, in 5 or 10 years, what we see is a whole lot less, projects in crypto. Maybe there's still meme tokens and things like that, but I don't think there's going to be a new sort of, layer one blockchain or a Bitcoin killer being built every month. And instead, things that we're talking about are just going to be built on top of Bitcoin.
Yeah, and of course, maybe a healthy consolidation too. Deven Soni is the CEO of Matador, joining us today. Thanks for this, Deven. Again, for our viewers, that company trades on the TSX Venture under the ticker symbol MATA. Happy holidays to you and your family. I hope all is well.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Talk soon, Deven. Appreciate it.
Right,
for
cheers.
all of us here at Kitco News, we want to thank you for watching. We're going to have some great content coming up all week long, including more from that upcoming FOMC meeting. So don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you soon.